There's a garden growing in the heart of urban industrial Sheffield, but it's not just any garden. This garden is actually an impossible garden, and it's impossible for a few reasons. The first is it's not in a place where you might expect to find a garden. It's actually located in a delightful safe wasteland called Furnace Park. And Furnace Park in my mind is sort of a fantastical space. It's an experimental space where nothing is quite what it seems. For example, let's take the name Furnace Park. The park element is slightly erroneous in that it's locked most of the time and you can't walk your dog there. And the furnace that the park is named after is outside and down the road about 5 minutes. So already Furnace Park isn't what you'd expect. And inside this urban wasteland that's been reclaimed, all the bombs have been taken out and the asbestos has been removed, there's a garden growing. And the people who put that garden there, they're not gardeners. They're not even garden historians. They're from the School of English. These are people who work with books and plays and poems and literature and print and emphatically not gardens. But they made a garden. There's only a few of them as well. One of them is a gardener. Well, one of them has green fingers and one of them is a gardener. But the rest are literary scholars, and they put this garden there. So it's in a strange place. It's in a place where you wouldn't expect to find a garden. It's been put there by people who aren't gardeners. But also, something that's really interesting and exciting about this garden is it's anachronistic. It's not from 2014, it's from the 18th century. There's an 18th century garden growing in the middle of Sheffield, and that's exciting, and that's a little bit impossible. But also, what I want to talk about today is how the fact that this place isn't just anachronistic, it's also intrinsically, instinctively, interdisciplinary, which is a word we'll unpack, in a way that I didn't think was possible. So it's an impossible garden. And the story I want to talk about today is how and why that garden came to be there. And also touch on a question that occurred to me numerous times as I worked on the project as a literary scholar, and that's, why is the School of English doing this? What has any of this got to do with books? And it does have a lot to do with books, I found out as it went on. So that's the story we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes. So the project's actually discernibly divided into two parts. There's physically, there is a garden, there are flower beds, there's a gardener, there's a place, it's in this park, you can go and look at it. So there's the garden that had to be grown. There's a few people doing it. There's heritage seeds, something I didn't know was a thing. Seeds that have been preserved from the 18th century. So you can actually grow 18th century versions of common plants like peas and asparagus and things. So that all happens. That's going to happen. There is a garden. But also on the other side, and this is the side that I was involved more with, there was the research, and there was a couple of researchers and a blog which you can look at, where we tried to situate this idea of the garden within an 18th century context. And this is where I was able to ask my question over and over again, what has this got to do with books? And it turns out it's got a lot to do with books. In fact, looking at 18th century print, the garden is there quite a lot. In fact, as we delved into this, it turns out that gardens and print, which I'm reading generously as literature today, are symbiotically related. It seems that the emergence of the garden in the 18th century is intrinsically linked with the emergence of print. So as an 18th century is something that I spend a lot of time talking about, is something that we refer to as print culture. And this was coming for a long time before the 18th century, but this is as the printed word begins to slowly get more cheaper, more accessible, more people can read it, more people can write it. So by the time you get to the mid-18th century, pretty much almost anybody can write and print, and almost anyone can buy print. And as this happens, more and more people start to buy things, and artistic taste is no longer decided by the palaces, by royal patronage, but instead by the discerning buying reader on the street. And what people bought, booksellers, entrepreneurial booksellers, made more of. And as we started to look at these books, we realised that as people start to have their own blessed plot, their own garden outside, other people start to write books saying to them, you should really do something with that. Do you want to know, you should make a garden, it should be pleasant. In fact, here's a book to tell you how to make that pleasant. And the more we looked into it, we couldn't really work out where this started. Did gardening manuals appear because people had gardens, or did gardens start to appear because gardening manuals told them they should have one? It's actually quite an entrepreneurial cycle there. So already print and gardens are linked. And then you've got all these books now, you've got your gardening manuals. Where are you going to put them? Well, you put them in the library, and we start to look at libraries, and actually it turns out that libraries and gardens are also instinctively, intricately linked as well. The more we looked into it, we found that libraries and gardens, which I suppose now we might consider as sort of cultural, artistic, non-essential spaces, actually in the 18th century serve a real pragmatic purpose. Healthcare in the 18th century is grim. as one of our MA students happily talked a lot about on the internet. If you get a cut, you die. You get a sneeze, you get a cold, you die. There isn't an NHS. If you want medicine, you're going to have to grow it yourself. And part of these gardening manuals, often we found one that was actually very exciting. There was a gardening manual and medical health text. So you'd buy it and it would say, if you've got this problem, you need this cure and you can grow it in your garden with this. And the library is where you have all of this knowledge. So you've got your garden where you're growing your medicine, you've got your library which tells you what to grow and what to do with it. Libraries and gardens, very important, very linked, gardens and literature working together there. And this idea of medicine was something that became more and more central to the project as we went on, and we actually spun it out and did a public engagement activity with a group of children from woodcraft folk, where we talked to them about how important gardens were in the 18th century and how they were a medicinal resource. And we actually had children looking at versions of 18th century texts and making their own 18th century medicines using plants that they would have grown in their 18th century garden, which was very exciting. And suddenly, in 2014, the garden was starting to create communities. So I've told you that we had this garden space. There's only 4 or 5 of us, but we've got hundreds and hundreds of heritage seeds as well. How are we going to grow these seeds and plants? Well, we used the Twitter to ask the people of Sheffield to grow them for us. And actually, there's another community that's spun out of this garden as well. And then we had dozens and dozens of people all over Sheffield growing parts of our 18th century gardening, Fulwood and Attercliffe and Nether Edge. And then they've all come together in Furnace Park in this magical space in our impossible garden. So you can see that just from the few minutes where I've glossed some of the things that we've done, gardens in the 18th century and now are a space where art meets science and philosophy and literature and medicine and science again, because that's a really important one. But also it's a space where it's something you experience in solitude. It's your garden, but at the same time facilitates these communities. So at once it is interdisciplinary, it is independent, it is community, it's bundled up with contradictions, all happen at the same time. And that's why it's an impossible garden. Thanks very much.